Hello, and welcome to this continuation of our ProBuilder series where we're going to be building a map for a first-person shooter game that is going to be a tutorial series coming up on this channel. So last time I encouraged you to build out a basic level that we're going to be having our characters move around in using primitive shapes with ProBuilder. Today we're going to take a look at editing a little bit more complex geometry using some advanced tools in ProBuilder. So to get started, I want to refer you to the four options that you may have noticed in your scene view. Starting from left to right, we have the object selection, and then we have the three foundations of an object. We have vertices, edges, and faces. So each of these are going to allow us to interact with an object in a slightly different way. To begin though, let's take a look at one of the arches that we implemented last time. You can select on any object in your scene to follow along. We want to first start by selecting the object using object selection mode. From there we can get more specific and say, okay, I'd like to modify the vertices of this object. So you'll notice all these white squares. These are all the vertices that you have available. We can select on any of the vertices and use the movement tools here to interact with them. So for example, if I were to pull this up, I can create a little bit more interesting geometry just by manipulating that one vertice. Similarly, if we now switch to the edge selection mode, we can take edges and we can manipulate them as well. So for example, I can click on this edge and bring it down just like that. Or I could hold down Shift to select multiple edges and move those down together at the same time. So for example, I'm going to Control Z a few times to undo my operations. Select this edge, hold down Shift, select this edge. Now I can manipulate these two together to create even more exciting geometry. So comparing this new arch that we created with the one back there, it's already significantly more interesting. And finally, we have the face selection. As this name implies, we're going to be able to interact with the faces. So for example, if we wanted to take this face, we could pull it out a little bit. Now notice our transform tools are doing what they say they're doing. We're simply pulling them around. Notice that we're not creating any new geometry with this. All we're simply doing is I'm just pulling this, and based on what you have selected, whether it be a vertex, edge, or face, they're all going to manipulate the object in a slightly different manner. Alright, so just with those three tools, you're going to be able to take any primitive shape and start interacting with the geometry on it to start to make it look like the object that you're trying to build. I really enjoy this because not only can you do it inside Unity, but it's really nice and it's going to allow your creativity to really flourish without having to leave your scene to go to an external tool to be able to develop these things. Alright, so I want to talk about some of the options over here. Now there are a lot of tools here, and I'll admit I don't know all of the tools on this list, but I'm just going to talk about a few of the most important ones that you'll be using over and over again. Now you may notice that as you have different options selected here, there's going to be different menus. Each time I click here, you'll notice that some of the options are changing. So depending on what mode we're in is going to determine what we're able to do to the object itself. So to get started here, one of the most popular ones that I'd like to talk about is the material editor. So the material editor is going to allow you to apply a texture to a face. So for example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my face selection mode here, because what I'd like to do is apply a texture to a face. So the fourth option from the top is the material editor. Go ahead and select that. It will open up this free-floating material editor window, and from here you'll notice that you have a bunch of different slots that you can assign materials to. So what you'll want to do is, I already have a default one here. You'll want to click the little circle next to this. That's going to bring up the ability to select a material. Now if you're just using a standard project and haven't imported anything yet, you're likely not going to have a lot of stuff. What you're going to want to do though is be able to create a new material. So for example, if we were down here in our assets folder, we could right click, create, and we want to create a new material. And for the purposes of this, let's just call it grass, because we're going to make it a green color. So if we take a look at this, we'll come over to the upper right hand corner, select the color, and we'll just make this a nice green color. Now if you wanted to do an image, so for example, if you were to search a grass texture online, you could put an image of grass in there very easily. You would want to download the grass texture here, and then what you're going to be able to do is drag that grass texture to this slot next to the albedo property, and that will assign that image to this material, and then you can apply it to your objects. Alright, so I want to take this green color that I just created, and I'm going to actually put it right there. So now, it looks like I also hit it on this object as I went, but we'll be able to change that in just a moment here. I do want to show you here that this is what it is currently key bound to, so Alt 1. So just remember Alt 1, and what that's going to allow us to do is we're interacting with this object here. So if I were to select on this particular face and on my keyboard press Alt 1, I can start to apply this texture to specific faces. So already that's going to give you an immense amount of control over texturing your objects with ProBuilder. So this is just a plain color, so it's not terribly exciting, but you can imagine once you have a bunch of colors and a bunch of materials with their image properties, this is going to come to life very quickly. So I would encourage you now to take some time with your scene, go through it, create some materials with a texture, and then just have fun coloring up your scene and bringing it to life. Okay, just a few more things that I'd like to talk about here. We'll have a more complex video covering the UV editor. I do want to talk about it a little bit though. The UV editor is very nice. It'll open up this free-floating box here that when you have an object selected, you're going to be able to use the UV editor on it. You can see this texture here, and we're going to be able to map a texture directly onto it. So if you don't know what UV editing is, you can imagine, let's say you have the primitive cube, for example, and we have a very thin sheet. For example, think of like a bed sheet, and it has your texture printed onto that sheet. We'd want to take that bed sheet and wrap it all around the cube so that it completely covers the surface of the cube. The purpose of UV editing is essentially to tell that object where we want the texture to be pinned to. So we'll be moving the texture around and getting it to exactly where we want, and that's where that texture is going to be pinned onto that object. We'll talk about this in an upcoming video here, but for our more advanced users, you can use the UV editor tool inside of here. Alright, so looking at this a little bit more, we're in the object selection one here. There are a few things you can do, such as subdivide objects, so that's a very popular one. For example, we can let me do Control Z if you didn't see that. When you press the subdivide object, we have a single, more or less, plane here. When I click subdivide object, you'll notice that if I go to face selection, we now have 4 individual faces. So that's going to give us a little bit more geometry to work with. If we press it again, you can imagine we can get this to be as detailed as we need it. Just remember that as you're creating more and more geometry, the more polygons you have means the more geometry is in your scene, and you can imagine that if you're duplicating this object more and more, it's going to take up memory, especially for those high polygon models, because Unity's lighting system is going to be interacting with every single surface on there to determine how the material that has been applied to it is going to reflect the light that is on it, and that can get very computationally expensive, and that's just for the lighting rendering. In addition, if you are having a complex object and you're using, for example, a mesh collider, we talked previously in a different video about colliders. So we have primitive colliders like your box colliders, which are in the shape of a box. They're very simple. But then we have mesh colliders, and mesh colliders, although are significantly more advanced in the sense that they will conform to the exact shape of the object, they are computationally much more expensive because they do fit to the shape of the object. So I would reserve your mesh colliders that you do generate for the most important objects in your scene. Game developers will typically get away with putting very basic colliders on an object. You may notice in your older video games, if you come up to like a rock or something, your character may not jump on the rock particularly. It may look like they're floating slightly above it. Well, that's likely because they're using a box collider instead of a collider that conforms to the exact, specifications of that rock. So just some things to keep in mind. Low polygon counts are what you want to strive for. So although I encourage you to edit your scene as much as possible, just keep that in mind as you are working. There are a few more advanced topics here, such as flipping your normals, as well as mirroring those that I'm going to leave out for now. Let's talk a little bit more about some things here in the face selection one. So the face selection, again, allows you to select a particular face here, and you'll notice that once we did that, we have a lot of different options available to us here. And let's just take a look at some of these. So I'm going to actually select this one in the corner so that we can interact with it. Now, one of the nice ones that people use a lot is the bevel tool. They'll use this specifically with edge selection a lot too, where if we're working with a particular edge, what we'll be able to do is bevel that edge. And if you click the little plus here, you can actually control how much bevel you want to be applied. And if we do that, you'll notice, if we zoom in up pretty close here, that we've actually applied a nice little bevel to the edge of this. So we'll be able to make that go around just like that. Alright. Some other things here as well. We have the ability to extrude edges from this as well. I haven't used that tool particularly too much, but that is something that you can do as well if you need to be able to pull up a specific edge for that. Being able to subdivide edges into multiple parts. So here you notice it's kind of hard to see, but my mouse is currently selected over the this part here, which is lighter, and then this part here. I can interact with these a little bit differently. You'll notice that as I'm pulling this up, our geometry is stretching a bit. That's just something that you want to keep in mind as you're going along and editing these things. You'll typically want to edit the model before you start applying textures to it, because the textures are going to be specific to whatever shape the object is in at the time that you are applying that to it. Okay. Other than that, I'd like to show you the extrude tool, so let me go ahead and click on this face here. Now, if we take a look down here, extrude faces is going to be one that you're going to use a lot. So we clicked on extrude faces, and that's going to allow you to bring up the geometry just like this. So if I wanted to create, for example, a corridor here, I'd click on these two, and I could essentially create a path. So if I wanted to create like a hallway, or even a room to an extent that my characters have to go down. These walls are obviously very thick, but you kind of get the point of what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to make a long hallway here that the character can go between. So something like that will be really cool as well. We have other things that'll be for you more advanced users, such as the ability to duplicate faces if you need an extra face for some reason, the ability to detach a face completely off of there. Now you'll notice we still have the wall there, but we have the face coming completely off. Now this does bring up a good point that I would like to talk about real quick. So in Unity we have planes, right? And a plane has a texture applied to it. Planes are one directional. Whatever direction the normal is coming off of is what the person is going to see. So if we need to see something, we need to see the normal. What does that mean? We're looking currently through this wall. If I were to spin the camera around, the wall is still there. If I come back around this way, the wall is not there. That's because this is theoretically an infinitesimally thin plane that's only visible through one side. So if we were actually doing walls, that's why I kind of recommend approach like this. This is obviously very, very thick for a wall, but you can't see through it like we can here. Because we detach the face here, we wouldn't be able to see through it in the first place. But if the character were to somehow get inside of this object here, suddenly I can see through the walls. I don't know if you played any of your old video games, but if you ever glitched into an area, this is the reason why you can start to see through walls and stuff. It's because planes are only visible through one. Now we can see this one here because this normal is facing out towards us. So just a little bit of background there in case you're ever wondering why that happens. The ability to delete faces is pretty self-explanatory itself. You can set triggers and colliders, so if you're not familiar with what those are, watch the physics video on this channel for a little bit more information about that. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I'd like to talk about to get you started. Edge loops, yes, are very important. So the ability to add additional lines, more or less. So what I clicked here again was insert edge loop, and that's going to, depending on what you have selected, it's going to insert a line going across, and then you can position that line. So we could position that line there, for example. And what that's going to do is give us the ability to say, okay, I want to bring this up, so I'm going to click extrude faces, and now I have a very thin wall here. So that would be a really nice way to do this versus having those thick walls that we had previously. And I think that will be it for this tutorial. I know I've been rambling on for quite a bit. So we covered a few very basic but very fundamental things in this video. How to use the material editor, and specifically how to assign them to hotkeys, and you can click and press Alt 1, 2, 3 to assign textures to faces. We saw how to manipulate basic geometry, your vertices, edges, and faces. We talked about the fundamentals of extruding, beveling, how to detach faces, and all of that. Those are the most important tools that I find myself using on a daily basis. As you get a little bit more advanced, of course, you'll be using those tools, and I do encourage you to take a look online at the ProBuilder documentation, as that documentation is actually very well written and does describe what each of the tools do in detail. So if you do have any more specific questions or video requests about a specific thing that you would like to see in ProBuilder that I did not cover in this video or previous video, please leave a comment or email your instructor and let them know, and I will be able to hear about it that way. I'm always happy to make as many instructional videos as I can. That is all. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section below or reach out to your instructor for more help. Thank you very much.